nationalist improvement on Tuesday as no president has done in times, comparing activists' disagreeing bias with the neo-Nazis and racial oppressors who rampaged in Charlottesville, Virginia, all through the finish of the week. Never has he gone as far in protecting their exercises as he did in the midst of a wild, street corner hollering match of a news meeting in the overlaid passage of Trump Tower, irately announcing that implied out-left activists were comparatively as accountable for the shocking experience as marchers employing swastikas, Confederate battle flags, threatening to Semitic gauges and Trump, Pence signs. Thankful to you President Trump for your reliability and strength to confess all, David Duke, a past Ku Klux Klan pioneer, wrote in a Twitter post not long after Mr. Trump talked. Richard B. Spencer, a white nationalist pioneer who shared toward the finish of the week's showings and guaranteed to surge Charlottesville with relative disputes in the coming weeks, was comparably bolstered. Trump's declaration was sensible and sensible, Mr. Spencer tweeted. Governor Terry McAuliffe of Virginia, a Democrat, wasted little time in reprimanding the president for adding to the divisions that put an undesirable concentrate on the commonly calm school town. Neo-Nazis, Klansmen and racial oppressors came to Charlottesville strongly equipped, hurling hatred and scanning for a fight, Mr. McAuliffe said. One of them executed a young woman in a show of neighborhood fear-mongering, and two of our finest officers were butchered in a shocking accident while serving to guarantee this gathering. This was not the two sides. No word in the Trump vocabulary is as tread-worn as uncommon. But people from the president's staff, incapacitated and agitated, said they never foreseen it would hear such a voluble clarification of sentiments that the president had since quite a while back imparted in private. The National Economic Council chief, Gary D. Cohn, and the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, who are Jewish, stayed by ungracefully as the president exacerbated a dispute that has eventually overpowered a White House and confound. I've blamed neo-Nazis, Mr. Trump told feature writers, who meddled with him more than once when he seemed to compare the exercises of free thinkers on each side. He talked about fine people on the two sides. And of the demonstrators who energized on Friday night, some rambling supremacist and antagonistic to Semitic trademarks, he expressed, you had numerous people in that assembling that were there to genuinely contradict and legally challenge. Since the 1960s, Republican lawmakers have made strong interests to white voters, especially those in the South, on sweeping social grounds. Regardless, if all else fails, they have taken a hard line on the social event's narrow-minded person, nativist and antagonistic to Semitic fringe. Presidents Ronald Reagan, George Bush and George W. Thorne totally censured racial oppressors. In 1991, President George Bush went up against Mr. Duke, who was then searching for the agent's seat in Louisiana, saying, when some person has so starting late grasped Nazism, it is immeasurable that some individual can sensibly try to a place of expert in a free society. In any case, Mr. Trump, who has again and again said he is not halfway, has been questionable in his open or private enunciations against white loyalists and other supremacist affiliations. On Saturday, in his at-first comments on Charlottesville, Mr. Trump blamed the fierceness for dissidents from many sides. After a storm of input over his remarks, Mr. Trump's partners affected him to coordinate his message by doling out unequivocal blame for the viciousness on far-right fomenters, which incited a more grounded denounce of loath groups, informed to reporters and credited to an unknown delegate. Exactly when that failed to stifle the conflict, partners, including Mr. Trump's new head of staff, John F. Kelly, pressed him to advance another open articulation. Mr. Trump's daughter Ivanka and youngster-in-law, Jared Kushner, urged him to take a more straightforward position, as showed by two people okay with the condition. However, as with such an assortment of other essential minutes in Mr. Trump's organization, the two were amidst a leave of absence, this time in Vermont. Grudgingly, Mr. Trump agreed. Bias is shrewd, the president said on Monday, passing on a declaration from the White House that was made with partners in the midst of plane and helicopter flights. The people who cause viciousness in its name are guilty parties and crooks, including the KKK, racial oppressors and other disdain get-togethers, He included, on account of bipartisan judgment of his more dark clarifications in the midst of the underlying 48 hours of the crisis. In any case, his uniting tone, which his staff depicted as more by and large presidential, quickly offered course to a more ordinary Trump approach. No sooner had he passed on the Monday clarification than he began railing furtively to his staff about the news media. He fumed to partners about how outlandishly he was being managed, and conveyed affectability for tranquil nonconformists who he said were defending their inheritance, as showed by a West Wing official. He trusted he had successfully given too much ground to his enemies, the expert said. Mr. Trump prides himself on an unashamed style he picked up from his father, Fred Trump, a New York City lodging designer, and Roy Cohn, a fierce lawful guide who filled in as a right hand to Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. In the midst of the 2016 presidential fight, Mr. Trump pulled in an important actor of racial oppressors, conveyed affectability for white Southerners doing combating to protect historic points for Confederate images, and was moved back to isolate himself from racists like Mr. Duke. The president's wrath created Monday as people from the White House business load up began to leave to challenge his reaction to Charlottesville. Clearly, Mr. Trump found his voice by tweeting angrily about the news media. By Tuesday evening, Mr. Trump's staff recognized the flawlessness of a characteristic cycle. The president would come back to his fundamental, more safe position. As Mr. Trump advanced toward the mouthpiece in the antechamber of Trump Tower on Tuesday, partners recoiled at the likelihood of an unmediated president. Everything considered. Out-left social events were in like manner, to a great degree unpleasant, Mr. Trump said immediately in his exchange with journalists. He proceeded to name blame on the two sides, resounding his comments on Saturday, and reigniting a fight that has sunk staff confirmation after a short thump in energy that took after the contracting of Mr. Kelly, who was to compel prepare on an uproarious West Wing. Eric Cantor, a past Republican congressman from Virginia who was a person from Republican activity, was frightened by what happened in Charlottesville, and said the president required stood up sometime recently. It really requested a declaration at indisputably the beginning stage, said Mr. Cantor, who is Jewish. He incorporated that attempts by the president to look at the exercises of the counter-protesters, however savage they may have been, with the neo-Nazis and the driver of the auto that slaughtered a dissenter were inadmissible.